Hello everyone, this video is probably going to be the most informative video on Hearthstone Battlegrounds that you guys will ever watch, covering one of the most important fundamentals, leveling. I'll break this video up into a couple of chapters covering extremely in-depth on when to level to each tavern tier. Once again, this guide is going to be meta independent, which means that you should mostly find this guide useful regardless of what meta it is. And because leveling patterns vary pretty significantly meta to meta, I'll definitely go over the variations and adjustments that you'd have to make under specific conditions of the meta. Also, some quick credentials because sometimes I still get comments like, what do you know? I've been rank 1 for like the past 10 seasons. Okay, let's just get right into it. Chapter 1, Leveling to Tavern 2. If you're relatively new to Battlegrounds, the one thing that can make or break your game is surprisingly your leveling curve. When you're building a house, the whole thing is just going to collapse without a good foundation, and it's the same thing here. Let's make sure we're buying the right units and leveling at the right times. To kind of gauge where you guys are at, let's start off with an exercise. What is the play with this opener? Like, what is your first 3 turns going to look like? The answer is definitely buy the front drake and freeze. And to understand this, let's get right into leveling curves. What's the point of leveling curves? Well, in the words of Hearthstone Battlegrounds educator Shadybunny, leveling curves exist to set up as good of a board state for the mid game as possible. And I think this makes a lot of sense. It's not necessary to win every fight, or else we just never buy economy units and pairs. Take Upbeat Front Drake, the current best 1-drop in the game, and Beleaguered Battler, the current worst 1-drop in the game. Why is Upbeat Front Drake so much better than Beleaguered Battler? Well, it tends to lose the first 3 fights guaranteed, but the ability to generate the 2 possible strong dragons on turn 3 and turn 6 most likely makes your mid game a lot cleaner, and we would be able to spend money leveling instead of filling out our board. On the other hand, Beleaguered Battler wins your first 2 fights, becomes a useless 0-5 unit, and becomes a unit you have to replace in the mid game. One unit is much more efficient than the other. One more thing I have to talk about just so we're on the same page. Your leveling curve is usually not set at the start of the game. Always curve out with your shops. You may be planning on buying 2 units on one turn, but then you see your shop is full of 1-drops. That's okay. You should be more flexible and level instead. I never want you guys to be forced to buy trash units because you feel like you have to level and follow a certain curve. With that out of the way, let's talk about leveling to taverns 2, 3, and 4. Most of the time, leveling on Tavern 2 is done on turn 2, known as Standard Curve. Sometimes it's done on turn 3, which is Jeef Curve, or turn 4, which is Reform Curve. And because the large majority of the time you actually level on turn 2, let's talk about the times you level on turn 3 and turn 4. And the rest of the spots, just assume that you'll level on turn 2. Leveling on turn 3 is currently a popular curve in Hearthstone Battlegrounds, especially with spells in. On turn 2, you usually buy a unit and a spell, and then turn 3 you level and buy either a 2-cost spell or an economy unit. I think you want to do this curve if you think staying on 1 would usually give you a better board state than if you had level. Think about these scenarios. You might be a Deathwing and you want 2 Annoyatrons on your board as fast as possible. You might be a Greybow and want 2 Mana Sabers on your board as fast as possible. You might be Xyrella, Yogg, or Scabs and just want to hero power every single turn. All are extremely valid reasons to level on turn 3 instead of turn 2. However, I do have to emphasize that if you decide to level on turn 3, you must ensure that you will not waste any gold. If you have a 2-cost hero power, that's easy. You just level and then hero power on turn 3. Let's say you're Greybow and your shop is Coin Mana Saber. Great. Turn 2, you double buy, and then turn 3, you just level buy. This is extremely clean. However, if your shop is instead Fortify and Mana Saber and you don't have a token in your shop, well suddenly you're in a spot where you have to get lucky with your next shop to get a token or a 2-cost spell to make your turn 3 clean. Even though this isn't the worst deal in the world, I think generally you should avoid this situation by just leveling turn 2 instead, as tempting as the second Mana Saber may be. So we've established that Coin Mana Saber you want to level on turn 3, Fortify Mana Saber, no token, you want to level on turn 2. Here's a good example. What about Lasso Mana Saber? You guys should think about this one. Well, the answer is actually you should level on turn 2. If you thought leveling turn 3 was tempting, well I do admit your turn 3 is really good, but wasting a gold on turn 2 is pretty bad. Remember, the early game isn't about winning fights. Who cares if you lose your turn 2 fight as a result in leveling? By leveling turn 2, you're just strictly saving the gold you otherwise would have wasted by staying down. Your turn 3 is then clean by just double buying the Lasso and the Mana Saber, and you probably should just hold the Lasso to use on an even better shop. This was an extremely clean standard curve. Something we learned here is try to make the most efficient line possible while buying quality units. If your shop on turn 2 was instead Lasso plus trash, I would not even consider freezing because that would violate the golden rule of Battlegrounds, which is don't buy trash. Okay, that was a ton of information, so don't be afraid to rewatch that segment if you're maybe unclear about anything. Let's move on to something easier, which is leveling to 2 on turn 4. Now, when is leveling to 2 on turn 4 correct? I know I said that you shouldn't set your curve from the very beginning. Well, this is mostly true, but there's one caveat. Reform curve heroes. Only 1 gold hero powers are allowed to do Reform curve. These heroes may include Cario, Reform, Galakron, Eudora, and this curve is pretty simple. You just level to 2 on turn 4 by buying a card and hero powering on the same turn. But please, please, please don't play this curve on any other hero. And the only reason why it works on these specific heroes is because it's the best and only way to squeeze in your hero power every turn. Actually, when I said when leveling curves are kinda meta specific, Reform curve is a great example of that. Typically, you never play this curve on heroes outside of those with 1 gold hero powers, but Tavern Tipper is a unit that has an effect which is kind of like spend 1 gold to give your Tavern Tippers +1/+2. And suddenly Reform curve becomes playable on every single hero with the introduction of this card. So I do want you guys to pay specific attention to variations like this one. Just be confident that your curve will work out before you play it. One last thing to note, leveling to 2 on turn 5 is obsolete now, but for the sake of mastery, let me explain why it was once good and not anymore. This is once again a meta-specific thing. Once upon a time, all 2-drops were horrendous and 1-drops were premium with cards such as Murloc Tidehunter and Alley Cat. A really good strategy would just to buy all these premium units, consistently get a triple or 2, and then go for 4-drops and 5-drops. In this meta, 4-drops and 5-drops were game winning. 4-drops contain multiple good avenge units that would win you the game on the spot if you hit it basically, and 5-drops contained Mithrax, Lightfang, and Mama Bear, which believe it or not was solid direction. Staying on 1 maximized the chance that you get a triple and define the rest of your game. Heck, a ton of people even level to 2 on turn 6 in this meta, just to make sure that they get these triples. Now you might be asking why people don't do this anymore. This is because, first of all, 5-drops are horrible and 4-drops aren't too game winning to triple into, alongside the fact that 2-drops got pretty good to the point that you overall lose too much tempo by staying on 1 too long, and get bullied by all the 2-drops you face. The bottom line is, even though this curve is dead, it may be revived again with future minion changes. You never know, and if a lot of people suddenly start talking about it again, you'll know when to play it and why. Chapter 2. Leveling to Tavern 3. If you thought leveling to Tavern 2 was pretty complicated, don't worry. I actually think leveling to Tavern 3 is pretty easy. Once again, the standard play is to level to Tavern 3 on turn 5, which is the standard curve. So I'm going to go ahead and cover all the scenarios that you wouldn't level on turn 5, and otherwise, you probably just level on turn 5. First, let's talk about leveling on turn 3, which is called 3 on 3. And it's definitely a leak in your gameplay if you're too scared to do it. I know the first thing on some of your minds. Every time I go 3 on 3, I just brick on my shop and die. Well, guess what? You're guaranteed to die if you stay on Tavern 2 buying 2 micro mummies or whatever your bad tavern shop is. Yes, there's probably more of a chance that you're screwed with a bad shop, but a lot of the times you're buying great 3 drops that can actually trade very well into your opponent's 2 drops, and you become ahead of the curve by turn 5. And if you're buying trash because you're too scared to go 3 on 3, you'll always be behind because just assume your opponents are not buying trash. The other thing you guys are probably wondering throughout this video is actually what is considered trash. I keep throwing around this term like it's so easy to understand what it is. Trash is something you just have to identify from experience because it varies greatly from meta to meta. Like Mithrax and Lightfang were once the best units in the game and became trash and is now removed. So instead, I'll explain some things that are not trash. On Tavern 1, remember how I discussed how a pair of Annoyatrons on Deathwing or a pair of Mana Sabers on Greybow are not considered trash? Well, these are strong pairs that directly impact the board. On Tavern 2, it's the same thing. A pair of Bowerback Bookie, a pair of Eternal Knights, a pair of Nerubian Deathstormers, a pair of Reef Riffers, you get the point. These are all strong pairs that you would want to buy. On the other hand, a pair of Moonbacon Jazzers or a pair of Micro Mummies are examples of pairs that you wouldn't want to buy because their board impact is just too little and you're already going to be put yourself behind. And pairs are important because it increases your chance at tripling into direction. The other thing that is not considered trash is synergistic combos. Skyfin Emissary is not trash because it's a combo that is strong for your board. Reef Riffer Lava Lurker is currently the most broken combo in the game, and Bonehead Grave Gobbler is another combo that is insanely strong on your board. Having these combos basically win you every fight in the early game, and then you enter the mid game with a solid board state, exactly what we want. The last thing that is not considered trash is a good play with a non-token start. Let me explain. Selling your turn 1 buy to double buy or level on turn 3 always feels the worst, so you should look for reasons to save your 1-drop. 2-cost spells, Tad, or Scout are very good reasons to stay down on Tavern 2 because they fix your curve. I think you guys are starting to get the hang of these early game fundamentals, so I'll go a little quicker for the rest of the scenarios. Leveling to Tavern 3 on turn 4 is usually just a matter of not buying trash as well. It doesn't matter what curve you're doing, the preference is always towards leveling as opposed to buying units that have no relevance being on your board. Don't buy a Hungry Snapjaw without beasts, don't buy a Grave Gobbler without undead, just level. Leveling to Tavern 3 on turn 6 is infrequent, so if you're doing this a lot, it's probably a leak in your play. Don't get me wrong, it's correct occasionally, but you need to plan out your next turn pretty perfectly to execute this curve. If you win your fight with overconfidence, and you also need to fill out your board because you may have like double Bronze Sand Spear or something, you can double level the following turn while keeping a full board. If you have double Bookie and really want to tip turn 5 because your shop has a Moonbacon Jazzer or something, as long as you're not buying trash, you can delay your leveling. The point is, when you're curving out, always think about your next turn. If you're in a spot like, okay, I'll do this play, and then next turn you're like, now what? That's a bad sign. You probably should have leveled. I probably have to talk about this point more, so I'll go off script to do so. The number one mistake I see low MR players making is just not thinking about the next turn in the early game. It's so crucial to curve out as efficiently as possible to get the aforementioned best mid-game board state as possible. Like if your next turn you need a 1-cost play, then you have to freeze your 1-cost spell. If your next turn you have a 2-cost play, you need to freeze your 2-cost spell. Like if you don't freeze the 2-cost spell and then the next turn rolls around and you're like, oh, I'll guess I'll just roll my gold instead. That's just like a game losing 2 gold that you just spent rolling, honestly. Because if you just start playing from behind, then you'll never be able to catch up. Chapter 3, Leveling to Tavern 4. Now we're getting into territory where we stop looking at the shops to know if we level or not, and we start looking at our board state. I'll go over the easiest scenario first. Scenario 1, you're committed to playing Quobors. Then you don't level to 4 until you have your Prickly Piper set up with good gem generation. I don't care what turn it is. I guess sometimes you can level for Rylak and that's your call, but just know that you really need that Piper when you're playing Quobors. And also, landlubber strategy, you don't want to level to 4 ever. Scenario 2, leveling to tier 4 on turn 4. You actually have to do this sometimes, but if you do overdo it, it's probably a leak. Sometimes you have no choice. Your shops are just too trash to buy. Then you go 4 on 4 for the same reasons that you go 3 on 3. And that's to just not buy trash. However, you're not going 4 on 4 to curve out or because you just want to do it. It's not a good spot to be in. It's just better than buying trash. Scenario 3. Level to tier 4 on turn 5. This is another don't buy trash moment. On turn 5 you have 7 gold, so your options are either double buy or level. If you're not able to double buy, you should just level, it's no problem. However, one situation is worth discussing because you guys will find yourself in this spot a lot. Let's say you level to 3 on turn 4, which is quite common, and your turn 5 shop has no buyable units. A lot of you would be tempted to roll, hoping your next shop has 2 buyable units. This is not consistent, and most of the times, you should just level here. I think this spot is complicated to explain in the sense that I've played it both ways, and just noticed that rolling on this spot just never works, so you guys should not roll in this spot either. Even if you double buy 2 good units, your next turn is still screwed. It costs 6 to level and you have 8 gold, so then you have to hope that you get an economy unit or a 2-cost spell to fix your next turn. And hope is not a good spot you want to be in, as I've taught you before. If your spot has 1 buyable unit, like a Dreadbeard Deflectabot, a Quartertron, go for it. The chance that your next shop has 1 more buyable unit is way higher than the chance that your next shop has 2. And then you're buying good units guaranteed and could feel pretty good about yourself. And of course, if your shop has 2 buyable units, go ahead and buy them. The other 2 scenarios I have to go over are leveling to tier 4 on turn 6 or turn 7. If you're leveling to tier 4 past turn 7, you're just under leveling and you're not putting yourself in a spot to play for top 4. I think to know which one to do, the first and foremost thing you have to observe is how many units your board has. If your board is full, then most likely you shouldn't be staying down and selling units for slightly better units. That's just way too inefficient. The other thing you have to ask yourself is if you're stable. You can only have 5 units on your board and still be incredibly strong. For example, if you have Reefer Lava Lurker Opener and you think you're strong enough to level to 4. However, there are situations where you'll also just most likely take 15 damage if you level because your board is just sucks. And maybe you take nothing if you stay down and buy good units. This is where it's extremely crucial to scout your opponent and evaluate board strength, but that's a topic I'll go in depth for another video. I think if your board is not full and if you don't feel yourself strong enough to level, then you should try to buy stabilizing units on Tavern 3. This once again includes great pairs, synergies, and maybe also significant board buffs such as Natural's Blessing. Let's do 2 quizzes to leveling to Tavern 4 because this one is very important to get right. In each of these two scenarios, do you level? Think about what we just discussed and what criteria we want to use to evaluate whether we should level or not. Okay, let's go over the left board first. Do we have a full board? Yes, we have a full board. Staying on 3 here, we would just be replacing our 2-2 and 3-1 units with slightly better units. It's not very efficient, so we generally want to avoid rolling on 3 here. So this is a definite level spot. And for the right board, you see that we went 3 on 3. We only have 3 units, and our shop has 3 pretty high quality units that are buffed, and our board is way too trash to level, and though buying those units will definitely stabilize us, so it's a definite stay down angle. Chapter 4, leveling to 5 or 6. You might ask yourself sometimes whether I should level to 5 or 6 and then proceed to be like, why not, the button's green, and then roll for nothing and die. Let's avoid that. Unlike the previous 3 tavern tiers, leveling to 5 and 6 is not at all about the turn number. You can level to 5 as early as turn 7, as late as turn 12. You can even win the game on tavern 4. There are a couple of considerations. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what am I leveling for? Valid answers to this question are, I would like to get to 6, or I'd buy this banana slammer, record smuggler, stuff like that. Or I have a lot of pairs, or I have a lease, and I'd like to triple into 6 drops. Invalid answers include because I feel like it, or to deal 1 extra damage, because if your goal is to level to 5 and roll for 4 drops such as Floating Watcher and Malchazar, your odds at hitting 4 drops literally decreases after you level, so you better have a good reason for leveling to 5. The same thing is for leveling to 6. Don't level to 6 if the cards you need with your board are mostly 5 drops. One thing I need to get out of the way. Rolling on tier 4, 5, and 6 is highly meta specific. In the past, there are metas where 6 drops were so horrible, people just never leveled to 6, tripled into 5 drops, and stabilized on tavern 4. There have been metas, such as this one I'd say, where 5 drops are pretty bad, and you generally don't want to triple into 5s or roll on 5 to stabilize. And there are metas where even 4 drops have been horrible and people just skip tavern 4, stabilize on 3, and just try to get to 5 as fast as possible. And this doesn't even have to be meta specific. This can easily be tribe specific. Specific tribes favor specific tavern tiers. Elementals and pirates favor high rolling on taverns 5 and 6, while a lot of people win out on tavern 4 with tribes such as kobolds and demons. Make sure you can name a handful of minions that you would buy before you actually press the level button. How silly would you sound if you told me that you'd level to 5 for Bongo Hopper? Well, in actuality, the cards you want are Tavern 4 units such as Rylak, Jazzer, Cleave, Spearhide, Bookie. I mean, that's just an example and will likely change as meta change, but the point is there are a lot of cases where you can level, but you shouldn't. However, even if you want to level to 5 or 6, a lot of the times you just can't. So the second question you have to ask yourself is, will I die if I level? If you're at 31 HP, most likely you will not die if you level. If you're at 15 HP with a not so strong board, I'm sorry to say, you're probably going to have to stabilize on Tavern 4 or Tavern 5 until you're content with your board. At some point though, there will be no more improvements to be made on your current Tavern tier, and your main power spikes are probably just going to be ending units such as Bramblewitch and Matador. In the past, there has been Leroy, other poison units cycling into rotation. Just the point is, be aware of which improvements matter for your board. A turn 7 Menagerie Jug is a pretty solid board upgrade. A turn 12 Menagerie Jug is a huge waste of 2 gold and you should not buy it. So if it's getting to those later turns, just even if you can slightly improve on 4, it's probably more productive to level to 5. It all depends on what your biggest improvement is, so before you start rolling, mentally list out a couple of units that you'd be happy buying. If that list is too short, 2 things. Either expand the list or just level because there's actually not anything on your current tavern tier that will improve your board. Lastly, there are cases where you have strong reasons to believe you'll win your next fight despite your low HP total or not so great board, and you just want to get to 5 to play for the win. Maybe this is because you got a ghost fight or you know that your opponent leveled to 6 with a pretty weak board. This is a good level spot, but you really don't want to be wrong in your assessment and lose the fight because that could just lose you the game. Let's end this chapter with some examples. This is an example of a board that can go straight to 6. It has massive mid-game tempo with the snapdraw and saved a lot of HP. Viable options on 6 then include Undead and Beast builds. And finally, there's lots of gold from the Corpse Refiner to easily pivot into one of those directions. This is an example of a board that will go straight 8th if you level. Your board isn't the worst, but none of your units give you that much tempo. There's not many great pickups on 5 with this board, and you definitely can't go to 6 with this low HP total. This is a spot where we need to buy as many stabilizing 4-drops as possible and or Elise. The module in shop is good enough to add some strength to this board, for example. This is an example that probably your board is good enough to go to 5, but you really just don't want to because the list of units that you'd want to buy here are actually Rylak, Jazzer, and Cleave and stuff. That concludes my entire video. This video was my longest video yet, and I would appreciate it so much if you just shared it with your friends that may just be new to Battlegrounds. As I've said before, leveling is such a crucial aspect to Battlegrounds, and I think I covered mostly everything you need to know about it. If you want to watch more guides, I have one on Direction already released, and you can see all my new ones as soon as I release them, and all you have to do is subscribe. That's it. Okay, see ya.